We are going to get started on our webinar that will be covering transaction laundering and building stronger defenses against payment fraud. So, as always, a quick disclaimer. Take a second to read the screen, but basically it says that this is for informational purposes. I am a lawyer, but I am not your lawyer, and this is not legal advice. Take it for what it is. Housekeeping. If you have some questions, please submit them to the GoToWebinar questions panel. If we do not have time to answer them, we will make sure to follow up with you via email. Also, be sure to check out the handouts section of your control panel for additional information. And then lastly, the recording of this webinar will be shared with you in the next couple of days. So if you think it merits sharing with someone on your team, you will absolutely be able to do so. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Neve Lewis. I am G2RS's Vice President of Compliance Operations. I oversee our team of over 100 analysts. By way of background, I am a regulatory attorney, as I hinted at earlier. I specialize in food, drug, and pharmacy law and other high-risk areas.
And my name is Sarah Craven. I've been at G2RS for over 8 years, and I'm the Director of Strategic Innovation. I've managed several of our merchant risk products, but with a particular and special emphasis on transaction laundering detection. Thanks for joining us today. So for our agenda, we're first going to cover an overview of what transaction laundering is, along with some recent trends, and then we'll dive into some case studies, some real-world examples for you. It's always the best part, and the specifics of G2RS's transaction laundering detection solution.
Okay, so we are going to start with an overview of transaction laundering. So transaction laundering, I think everyone on this attending this webinar knows, but just in case, we're going to pause and have a moment. Transaction laundering occurs when a business that is unknown to the payment provider processes payments through an approved merchant's credentials, which then of course leaves the payment provider exposed to substantial risk. So we get asked a lot about the difference between transaction laundering, which is what we're talking about today, and money laundering. And this seemed like a good opportunity to address that topic. Money laundering is the process of disguising the proceeds of crime so that illicit funds entering the financial system appear to be legitimate. Basically, it's the umbrella term, right? Transaction laundering is a specific subtype of money laundering in which criminals are processing payments for illegal goods and services through a merchant account in the payments ecosystem of what appears to be a seemingly legitimate business. So they're hiding the true source and nature of those transactions. So now I'm going to walk you through transaction laundering. This is partly, again, so we're all on the same page, and also partly because this is my favorite little moving image. So we're going to start with the consumer or buyer. And in this case, our consumer or buyer is essentially up to no good. They are going to be buying some illegal drugs. And then they have to, of course, pay for those illegal drugs. And on their end, they put the payment in on that illegal drugs website. And then from their perspective, everything's going great. They get their illegal drugs. Now, on the back end, that payment is rerouted through a merchant account, in this case, a t-shirt website. And this is the merchant that has the account with the acquirer. And so the acquirers only see that a payment has been made to the t-shirt website. And so that transaction is now considered cleaned. And it goes through the acquiring bank, and the launderer runs away with the money. That's why it's my favorite, because of the running away with the money. So from the payments providers, like what's the problem for payment providers? The problem is transaction laundering front sites, like that t-shirt website that we just showed, looks innocuous or benign. Those merchants look low risk. They are literally hiding in plain sight. So you can see on the screen, we've got a kitchen gadgets merchant, and then the one on the left is a merchant selling soccer gear. They seem totally legitimate on the surface, but these are actually confirmed laundering front sites. So why should and why does the payments industry care? And the answer to that is very visible on the screen. The vast majority, I mean, obviously we all care because you don't want to be processing for bad actors, but the vast majority of card brand assessments are also for violating sites that are running their payments through front sites. And so why do they do that? Well, they do that because bad actors are trying to keep these merchant accounts open for as long as possible. And so they want to avoid detection. And the best way of doing that is transaction laundering. Also, the payment ecosystem has just gotten better at content compliance. So in the past 10 to 15 years, 10 to 15 years ago, acquirers didn't really have the tools to do wider scale detection. So it was easier for merchants to sort of sell things directly and sort of slip through the cracks. So because this webinar is part of a sort of three-part series on the transaction, on the merchant life cycle, the question we should ask is where transaction laundering should be evaluated as part of that merchant lifecycle. And so basically it should be considered throughout the merchant lifecycle. So when you onboard a merchant, you want to know if their website or their MID or their phone number or their address has previously been associated with known or suspected launderers. And then, of course, let's say they clear onboarding, you want to keep an eye on that merchant and see if they are determined to be part of a laundering network, right? And because we find out new information on these networks are vast, and Sarah will go into more detail about laundering networks. Then, you're there in monitoring, everything's good, or hitting towards the right side of the screen. You may decide to engage in a periodic audit, like maybe on a specific time cadence, or you may decide that something may trigger re-underwriting. Maybe there's a new risk flag or a business model change, and you're going to want to make sure that your data is up to date, and so there can be additional checks at that time against known or suspected launderers. So that was sort of the basic background. Because Sarah is the true expert in this space, so I am going to hand it off to her to provide you with details regarding how these bad actors are really growing more sophisticated.
Thanks, Neve. Yeah, so the world of transaction laundering is very similar to that of more general fraud, where it is continuously evolving, and the bad actors that are involved in it are becoming increasingly savvy. And in 2015, GTRS launched the first transaction laundering detection product on the market. And since then, we've really seen a drastic evolution of the techniques that launderers take to hide their tracks and evade detection. Whereas back in the day, we would see pretty obvious indicators of laundering, like a billing descriptor being displayed on the actual checkout page of a site selling violating content. We're now seeing launderers do things like rotating data points, load balancing across multiple MIDs with different acquirers, and utilizing algorithms to avoid triggering those sort of transaction-based monitoring risk thresholds. And so all of these practices combined really create a network and a situation that can be a lot more difficult to detect. In addition, launderers have begun creating really vast networks of front sites, like Neve mentioned, that they're onboarding with different acquirers and PayFacs to avoid detection and to keep those transactions flowing, right? And again, this can often include rotating or randomizing data points, such as their billing descriptor, contact information, site registrant data, and domain name servers, mail servers. All of those data points connected to the merchant can be easily swapped out and balanced across a lot of different accounts. And one of the interesting things that have come out of the rise of large laundering networks is these business types that are actually offering laundering as a service. And that's where those savvy techniques that I was speaking about on the last slide are significantly scaled up and actually sold off to bad actors on the dark web or forums. And these networks can often incorporate things like stolen personal data that's combined with alias information to create essentially a synthetic identity. And because that incorporates some real, stolen personal data, that's a lot harder to detect during onboarding than your sort of run-of-the-mill returning bad actor that has the same data points. We've also seen and heard numerous cases of straw owners or money mules that are actually paid to open merchant accounts under their own name to also allow those bad actors to avoid detection. And finally, AI is such a buzzword in the last few years, right? And of course, launderers have latched onto this technology as well. So the rapid evolution of AI has facilitated increasingly evasive launderers. The front sites of the past often were pretty bare bones, and they had things like sparse or placeholder text, the Latin verbiage, limited products that a consumer could select, maybe the same stock image being used for multiple products on the site, empty contact information, broken social media links, like all of these factors that show very little effort in their creation. And with the use of generative AI, we're seeing an increasing number of front merchants that have pretty convincing text and content on their sites. And that's sort of in alignment as well with that increased scale of laundering networks that are using templated formats that are similar, but not as obviously so as maybe they were in the past. So on the slide, you can see a couple of examples in the same network that have pretty standard website components like the pricing options and links at the bottom of the page, but they are different enough that you could question if they're actually connected or involved in laundering. So those are just a few ways that the world of transaction laundering continues to evolve. And from here, I'll pass it back to Neve to touch on a few real world examples, the fun part.
Is the fun part. Okay, I'm going to start with the easy examples and then I'll hand it back to Sarah for the hard examples, or the hard example, I guess. So here we have a very simple transaction laundering scenario. And so what we're looking at is a peptide merchant. And for those who don't know, a peptide merchant is they are selling what they claim are research chemicals or not for human consumption, and they're really prescription-only drugs or unapproved drugs that are intended to be used by humans. The seller knows they're being used by humans, the buyer knows they are, and these merchants have become a big focus in the last couple of years in the payments industry, mostly because they all now offer GLP-1 agonist drugs, which are your Ozempic, Wegovy, your hot weight loss drugs. So here we have a bad actor who is selling semaglutide, which is more commonly known under the brand name Ozempic. And you can see on the screen that I protected their name, just protecting the guilty there, but they were a peptide merchant. But then when I went to the checkout cart, it automatically redirected. So a consumer who's really paying attention should even see that the URL bar up there at the top it's a different URL, right? And that is a front site posing as a cybersecurity firm. And it's literally telling the consumer on the screen in the little red box that the transaction will appear to be coming from a cybersecurity firm on the consumer's billing statement. Now, This is the home page of that same checkout page. If you go to the home page of the billing page, you're going to see the front site right there. It's posing as a cybersecurity firm. And so, to be clear, not all transaction laundering scenarios are this obvious. In fact, this type of transaction laundering is becoming increasingly rare. I mean, this is the kind of laundering that, like, you can really figure out on onboarding if you go through checkout. Typically, the front site is discovered via a test transaction with a mid match or an address match, rather than something that, or phone number, rather than something that is like literally being shared with the consumer right there. So here we have a different type of transaction laundering. Again, it's a little different from your standard that I just described, where you really need that test transaction to connect the launderer to the front site that they're using. Here, the violating site is selling illegal streaming services, and when the consumer chooses a subscription, they go through the checkout process and they're sent an email. And so the email is literally providing instructions for the consumer to go to a well-known marketplace that I will not mention and buy a cooling fan. I mean, that's where the link goes. If the consumer, they're telling them right there on that, in that email, if you want a 1-month subscription, choose one piece. If you want a 12-month subscription, choose 12 pieces. And so here is a screenshot of the marketplace with the bogus cooling fan. The marketplace undoubtedly has no idea that it is being used to launder transactions. So obviously the cooling fan does not actually exist. I mean, probably exists somewhere, but it's not going to be shipped to the consumer. And this is just being used to sell illegal streaming. And so with that, I will hand it off to Sarah for a more complicated example.
All right, thanks, Neve. Our third example is a gambling laundering ring that was identified through sort of additional analyst research and networking following that test transaction. And the gambling site on the left was one of actually several in a large violating site network. And just one of them, which an analyst executed a test transaction on. And that test transaction allowed us to identify the laundering merchant, which in this case was that clothing and accessories merchant that you see on the right. From there, the G2RS analyst team has started to network out from the launder and found 60 additional sites through a mail server IP connection that share the same layout, same verbiage, which makes them pretty likely launders as well, even though the test transaction didn't necessarily go through these exact merchant accounts. You know, again, going back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, these networks are growing. Often the violating sites are sort of load balancing across multiple merchants. And so it's very likely that as we would continue to test sites in that violating network, that we would see transactions going through some of these other merchants that were found. And an important note that I want to make on networking is that when our analysts are going through that process, there are really dozens of different data points that are checked. And because those bad actors are getting a lot sneakier at hiding their tracks, sometimes it's not even a direct connection. There could be connections of a connection, and the true network could really be hiding several layers deep. And sometimes analysts even need to combine different data points. Let's say you have a mail server IP plus a phone number that really narrows in the network and allows them to see the sites that actually seem to be connected to a known launder. And that's why expertise is so important when completing those investigations. It's increasingly difficult to know where to look because, again, bad actors are becoming more savvy, and also increasingly important as those laundering networks continue to broaden. So we touched on this a little bit already with the examples, but I wanted to provide a bit more context into G2RS's approach to transaction laundering detection. So there's a few different ways that we identify laundering. So the first is our test transaction process. Again, this was referenced in a couple of the examples you heard already. But really the first step of this is sourcing thousands of violating sites monthly. We are looking at all different content types when we're doing that sourcing. So things like illegal drugs, pharmaceuticals without a prescription, gambling, IPTV, adult content that's a bit more egregious, any type of content which is very unlikely to get approved for a merchant account would be fair game when we're doing this sourcing. All of the sites that we source are then queued for test transaction by our analyst team. And some of that also includes sites that we've sourced in the past, right? Because if a launderer gets shut down for processing through an individual merchant account, as discussed, they'll often cycle through other merchants, right? So we want to continue to retest those violating sites that we know about to detect other merchants that they're processing through. So as that test transaction is taking place, the analyst is actually walking through the checkout process as if they are a consumer. They utilize alias information and submit a test card from one of our issuing partners. Now, of course, those are always set to decline. We don't actually want prescription-only drugs showing up in the mail somewhere. And in that test transaction process, I think it's important to note also that we see a lot of different types of site behavior. There are some situations where it's not as cut and dry. You know, you can't submit that test card in the checkout right away, or the violator doesn't run the card right away and requires some sort of additional verification. Sometimes this looks like receiving a payment link and a live email address. And so because of all of the different use cases involved, it's really crucial to keep those behaviors in mind to get full coverage of that violating site and really understand its behavior and to prevent laundering from occurring. So once the violating site does attempt to process the card, again, whatever path that ends up taking, we're going to receive that authorization attempt instantly through our issuing partner. And this is reviewed by our analysts to determine whether or not it's a true positive match. And then that authorization data is scanned against the entire G2RS merchant map to detect connected merchants. Any connected merchants are then reported out as transaction laundering leads for our customers that are affected. And then there's actually an additional step where analysts will do that networking that I was referencing and add other connected sites that are not under monitoring also into the merchant map. And that's really a crucial underlying piece of all of G2RS's products. And so you see all of that data from the violating site sourced to the authorization details that we gather to those connected merchants either in or outside of monitoring that we gather through research, all flowing into the merchant map. And that enriches not only transaction laundering detection, but our global onboarding and persistent merchant monitoring products as well. So again, going back to that merchant lifecycle idea, it's really important to continue to aggregate and enrich that merchant map to feed across that entire merchant lifecycle that our products cover. All right, and that merchant map is utilized in transaction laundering detection. As I mentioned, we call this our known launderer scan. And essentially, when a merchant gets sent to G2 for monitoring, as well as on an ongoing basis, we continuously scan them against previously identified launderers. And we're looking at a lot of different data points here, the merchant URL, billing descriptor, their contact details, again, registrant connections, and we're flagging any sort of connection to our customers that ties that merchant to a known laundering network. So you can see an example on the slide. RID advisors, in this case, would be the merchant that's added to monitoring, and multiple data points from that merchant, again, are scanned. And in this example, they're showing a shared registrant data point connection. And when that's published out to a client, we always link it to the known launderer and that original violating site that we linked to that previously identified launderer. And the reason the ongoing scan is so important here is because one, a merchant could change their data points at any time during their merchant life cycle, right? Like when you are underwriting a merchant, they in 2 months later, they could change their phone number, they could change their principal. And so any of those things that are swapping out could present a new opportunity to connect to a known launderer. And similarly, we're finding new launderers all the time, right? And we're expanding those networks constantly. And so any of those data points that we're collecting and using to enrich the merchant map, like that at any point could create a match to merchants we have under monitoring. All right. So that's the content that we have for today. From here, I'll hand it back to Neve for some Q&A if we have time, which I think we have a couple of minutes at least, and we'll go from there.
Okay, so I will make sure to give you a little, little instructions for the end of the presentation. So if you have questions now, then you can put them into the chat. There are also solution sheets again available in the handouts section. There's also, I believe, a recent blog post in the chat, but I'm not positive on that one. But please check out our blog. There are blog posts. So we do have a few questions, and I think we have time for at least one or two. So I will read out the first one. Is there a way to tell if a website is a front site? And I'm going to let Sarah dig in on that because there are definitely ways, like, there's all sorts of ways. But one of the things I will flag is if you are a G2RS client, we have actually created a sort of client-specific training guide on identifying front sites and sort of for your teams. And that just given independently to your specific team. It's not like a big webinar like this webinar. It will be just you bring the people in your team if you're interested in it. It was created by our transaction laundering detection team as a way to sort of all work together and partner with you to sort of help you identify these front sites on the front end. So Sarah, I will let you answer the real question, which is there a way to tell if a website is a front site other than watching
Sure.
that training?
Yeah, so there are sort of our, like, you could say the historical clear ways, which are, we mentioned a couple of them in the presentation, but those bare bones layouts, broken social media links, stock images, again, that's becoming increasingly rare, but we do run across that from time to time. So particularly, in the underwriting process and whatnot, that's something to pay attention to. Generic reviews on the site is another one, or site text that is copied from other websites. Again, that can be a little bit more difficult to detect, but there are tools out there that we utilize, for example, that can do that. I would say also use of common templates. Again, we showed a couple examples of those throughout the presentation, and then use of uncommon top-level domains as well. So your .store, .site, especially if the domain name itself is super long, can be a red flag. So that's just a handful, but again, the presentation that needs referencing goes into a ton of detail around some of those factors.
And I'm going to throw in a couple more because I can think of them. Is the website findable on a search engine, right? So there is source code you can put in to make you not findable. Why would anyone want to not be findable on a search engine if you are trying to engage in e-commerce, right? So that's a red flag. And then also social third party internet presence. Like, can you be found on social media? Are there reviews? If those things are scant or entirely missing, I would say that is also common among front sites. Am I right, Sarah? Let me double check.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great. Be here, Pro Team.
Thank you. So we have less than a minute. So I guess we have other questions, and I really appreciate that people actually ask questions in the chat. So thank you very much. But because we only have 1 minute, if you asked an actual question in the chat, and again, thank you, that's awesome. We will be sure to get back to you via email. But thank you for joining us as we've talked about transaction laundering, which is juicy and fun. So I'm glad you joined us.